Hirakumar, Soya, 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 Soya.
Hello, and welcome to Lesson 70 at Namas University. This is WISEONE. Today I would like to speak about a number of mechanisms that have enabled the dark side to maintain control of planets. Let us begin with the matter of contracts. A contract is a binding agreement between two or more parties, much like the legal documentation used in day-to-day society on Earth. A contract contains the more or less specific conditions for the exchange of goods or services, or the right to participate in a community. Contracts do not need to be fair, just, ethical, or mutually beneficial. They just need to be accepted in one form or another between the parties involved. This practice was established not long after the discovery that collective willpower could be harnessed to serve the needs of the many over the few, steering timelines towards mutual goals rather than leaving it to fate by the chaos of individualism. Please refer to Lesson 60, where I discussed the topic of willpower. During the early days, contracts had agreeable terms. After all, who would, in their right state of mind, make unreasonable sacrifices without reasonable returns? At least this was the case for the early founders of such unions. The honeymoon period of such unions was deeply beneficial to all of those that enlisted. They had to be. The agreements were made in earnest, honest and trusting. Mutual gain was at the top of the agenda and afforded security to endeavours. They were more likely to gain traction when the willpower of many were focused towards common goals, curiosities and aspirations. Not only was this highly productive in terms of results, the bonds of mutual service allowed for specializations, collaboration, and venture into realms that would be otherwise unmanageable as a singular being. These unions provided opportunities for rapid learning, both individually and collectively, as resources could be pooled with less concern of unwanted influence and interruption. It allowed for greater risk-taking, as the faculties of the group could buffer failed attempts that may have otherwise crippled an individual in the free-for-all chaos of that time. It was a time of excitement for sure, and these unions were forming up with abandon, with many unions attracting countless others to join up and to be a part of the teams. One thing was clear: as the member lists grew, so did the influence and collective willpower of the unions, and with that, the appeal of joining such groups. It became apparent to the shrewd that as the power base expanded, outsiders were willing to agree to less favourable terms to join. Naturally, those that had founded these groups felt they had invested too much already to give equal rights to newcomers, wanting instead to maintain at least some authority over its exploits so far and those new to the group. This was the beginning of exclusivity, the advent of tiered organizations where mutual benefit was starting to skew in favor of some over others. As mentioned before, Fairness is not a requirement of a contract, only acceptance. Unions with overly authoritarian founders, at least in the beginning, failed to attract new blood. The deal they had to offer simply wasn't attractive enough to those that expected a balance between give and take. As organizations grew, new recruits wanting a piece of the pie and the benefits it bestowed were willing to accept less and less in exchange for entry. After all, these powerful organizations had tangible influence and wealth of opportunity. As time went on, the disparity between the share value of the founders and those of new recruits became wider and wider, resulting in a very noticeable formation of a class structure. Families of power had much greater say over the policies and directions the organizations took, while those at the bottom had to adhere to the agreed outcome or face the consequences of breaching contracts. Power continued to grow as the masses flocked in. Those at the top, the founders, and senior ranks forged the way, gaining more authority over their flock as the newest members gave up more and more of their own willpower as laid out in the terms and conditions. With power comes privilege and wealth. Those born into powerful families inherited the privileges of their parents. Class and status became generational. Advancement in a community could be granted easily by those already accepted into influential positions within the community, but by few other means. This did not go unnoticed by the lower ranks. Resentment grew, and with that, countermeasures to stifle and placate the civilian unrest unfolded. Governance became formalized, positions of office were established. Legal structures were developed as well as policing and military forces recruited. This allowed for even more subjugation, giving greater control to the few to reign over the many. This was all achieved through contracts. Contracts gave access to power, influence, and privilege, and only those that already held it could grant it. Law reform saw to that. From the outside, it did indeed look like a democracy. But through the law structures put in place, it would become very clear how little say an individual had. They were as powerless as that, an individual. They had agreed to give up their authority to an organization to gain access to opportunity, but received no such guarantee to attain it. For those that saw through this, they realized that to lose their current contract of position would mean being cast down in society, to grovel by comparison as the lower classes did. A raise in one's place in a community can only be awarded, not as a right but as a reward. Toe the line, sign above the dotted line. When power was granted through a position of office, such as in a governing body, consequences of breaching terms were spelled out very clearly and graduated in severity in line with the offence. It is amazing what terms and conditions the desperate and oppressed are willing to agree to in order to get ahead in what appears to be an affluent community, or should I rather now say civilization. Propaganda and censorship played its role for keeping the lower ranks obedient. And where that did not work, more direct approaches were utilized. After all, by being a member of the community, meaning society, citizens gave authority to the rule of law and the punishment of breaking it. This is the nature of law and order, and was how most communities grew to be structured societies, and many still are. Those that already attained positions of power, nor blind to the moral bankruptcy of such structures, reminded themselves to forfeit their own contract of privilege in protest, would likely result in exile, would not be regained, and certainly not with such favourable conditions as before, especially in a society where demand exceeded supply. This was threat enough for many not to raise their heads above the parapet. Competition for a top spot was rife, and the upper echelons of these societal models were close to the lower ranks, after all. There were enough of those that revelled in the privilege that they received in such positions of power to put a stop to any significant reforms that might tip the scales of power away from those that already had it. Huge civilizations spanning galaxies have adopted such models, megacorporations, galactic confederations. It is not the only way for a society to function, but it is the most prevalent. It would be unwise to assume that any organization is wholly singular. An organism or organization is a community, both in the biological sense and as a society. Take cells or organs in a body, or different roles within a group of people. Collectively, the community serves the whole, and so that it can be sustainable, there needs to be cooperation of its parts to keep it functional. When this is not the case, it finds itself at a point of stagnation, decline, or collapse. Sometimes the only way to gain enough energy to sustain itself, an organization must enter the realm of parasitism and predation. In extreme cases, it may even start to metabolize its own non-essential parts to sustain its more vital systems. The probability of these circumstances increases as an organization grows in magnitude, especially if bogged down with inefficiencies and an appetite far larger than it can satisfy from its current territory. At some point or another, the idea of taking by force comes into the picture. The next logical step to consider after this is, once a resource is taken, how does it secure a steady supply or retain what is stolen? The Anunnaki who ceased control over Earth were part of such an organization that had reached this point. As a result, Earth follows such a similar structure too, still today, and suffers the same pitfalls of such a societal model: greed, exploitation, corruption, and self-destructive tendencies, at least from those in power. Until the people of Earth were willing to break their contracts with such an organization, they would remain firmly in its grip. How can you break this contract, you might ask? Most of you already have. An invitation was broadcasted across the planet to each of your souls very recently. All but 500 million incarnated humans on this planet agreed to have the black contract broken. Organizations can be changed. They can be usurped, infiltrated, and overthrown from within, or encouraged to simply make poor decisions that expose further weaknesses. Ironically, the very same tactics learned from the dark side have been used by the light to undo such efforts, crumble dark organizations, and that has been very successful. The small fraction that remains on Earth, still bound to dark contracts, are the ones unwilling to let go of their authority in a dying organization. The same can be said to be happening across the galaxy. The legacy of the Anunnaki is at last ending. It is just a matter of time before those tied to them come to their senses as well. Much has changed, and we will tell you more in the next podcast of the Divas. Thank you for listening to Namas University. If you had not heard already, we have published Yeshua, Light Language, The Sound of Creation by the Divine Eternal Source, English edition. It was written by Yeshua through Katerina Adari. Link is in the description. Please join us again next week. You need to be aware of what is currently happening on Earth, in our galaxy, and the cosmos. This will be expanded upon by the SANAT KUMARA.
Hirakumar, Soya, 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 Soya.